Hey, it's been a while and I am only recording videos now when I am kind of flagged by the urgency of a certain topic that comes up in my podcast, which is called A Breast Cancer Diary. You should check it out. But I had a guest that really brought up something profound this last week, and I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about it, and I thought this would be a good place to do it. A lot of my YouTube audience hasn't found my podcast yet, so be sure and look for it both on YouTube and your podcast players if you're interested. But regardless of that, I just wanted to talk about self-blame and responsibility for cancer. This is a huge hot topic, very, very triggering for some people. Some people just do not even want to talk about this or think about it, and I totally understand that. Guilt is a powerful thing. Shame is a powerful thing. And it's also powerful to get out of it, to get free from it. And that's why I'm making this video. I really want people to feel free. I feel like a little bit of an expert on this because I'm a nutritionist, and I've been a nutritionist since about 3 years after my first cancer scare. I became a nutritionist because of my first 2 cancer scares. I had uterine polyps, which are believed to be precancerous. For most knowledgeable oncologists these days, they believe that almost all polyps in the uterus are precancerous. So I had precancer in my uterus, and then I had a very suspicious shadow in my left breast that did end up 10 years later becoming cancer. So it was a legitimate cancer scare in that case, and it was not preventable. So I have a lot of self-blame and shame myself because I became a nutritionist to avoid getting breast cancer, and I failed at getting that avoidance. And so I want to talk about this kind of as somebody with a lot of experience in this. My podcast guest last week, Avina, is a friend of mine, and she just said it so powerfully. She said, I thought the first time I had cancer, I thought I must have done something wrong. And I think that is a universal response to cancer. Maybe not to other diseases, or maybe more so with other diseases like diabetes. That's pretty linked to lifestyle choices, or at least it's believed to be. So we think when we get a disease, I must have done something wrong. It's just natural to think that. There's nothing wrong with having that response. It is a very human response, and probably even more of a tendency for those of us who grew up in more of a religious setting like I did. And so I think that it's powerful and scary and really important to identify the root of it and the beliefs behind it, and some of the false beliefs that are behind it as well. Avina also said that the second time she had cancer, almost 30 years later, she had a community of really loving women around her, and that community took away that answer, the need to answer that question, did I do something wrong? Because that community, just in their presence, without saying a thing, just their presence said, you did not do something wrong. And so I think having people around us when we're diagnosed, after we're diagnosed, as we're struggling with risk reduction as a survivor is so important. It's so essential to our belief systems as well. But I want to talk a little bit more about the brass tacks of, did we do something wrong? Is there something that we can know that we did wrong? I want to say first off that my bias is that we don't have enough science, we don't have enough research to answer that question. We know some of the possible avenues of getting cancer in the first place, and we know some of the possible avenues of growing cancer once it's in us. So those are 2 very different biological processes. Getting cancer in the first place, we believe it's carcinogenic related, but there's a lot of questioning of that, and we're adding on certain things like viruses as a possible original seeding of the cancer. And of course, there could be other things too, and we might be wrong about some of these things also. Science is very established at this point in history, but it's also very young in a lot of ways, and we don't have all the answers. And then in terms of growing cancer, we know that it has something to do, in breast cancer at least, with estrogen in many cases. At least for those of us who have more of a natural tumor or a natural lesion growing in us, it's usually somewhat fed by some kind of estrogen. But we don't fully understand what kinds of estrogens because there are so many different kinds of estrogens in the world. And there are some in our water and our air. There are some all around us that we can't even fully extract from our environment. So there's a lot of powerlessness when you think about that. There are also lots of other things that can grow cancer besides estrogen. And an environment of growth is what they're learning in science is one of the most powerful things. If you have an environment of inflammation, for example, in the body, or an environment of autoimmunity where your immune system is already somewhat broken or not working quite as well, then, we have those kind of defects, those kind of weaknesses that we can't really do much about. And so my argument is that even those who are following the most incredibly stringent lifestyle practices, getting lots of sleep, getting lots of stress management and reduction, getting only the purest, healthiest foods and the healthiest kinds of foods, getting lots of good exercise, not too much, not too little, not so much that it's creating an environment of inflammation or stress in our body, but just enough exercise. Even if you have all of those things in place, it's still very possible to both get breast cancer and grow it at some rate, maybe a slow rate, maybe in some cases a fast rate, depending on some of the other factors that you have going on. Things like other viral infections, chronic viral infections like Lyme or Epstein-Barr, heavy metal exposures. We store heavy metals in our bones. We can't even really measure how much heavy metal is in a given body, but our body is affected by the load of heavy metal exposure that we've had in our lifetime. And that's probably why older people traditionally get cancer more often. We have more of a toxic load that we're carrying, that we're bearing, and it does affect the way that we deal with disease or fight disease. Like I said, we don't have an extensive list of what seeds cancer or what grows cancer yet. We have a lot of good hints and a lot of good starts, but we don't fully understand this very complex process, especially with breast cancer. The whole idea of estrogen being the enemy is really balked at by a lot of scientists. A lot of scientists know there's a ton of research saying that estrogen, our natural estrogen, the kind that is made by our body, is actually a cancer treatment that's really effective. If you get natural estradiol or natural estriol, in many cases you can see the research that it fights breast cancer. Isn't that confusing? Well, it's not as confusing when you understand that there's hundreds of environmental toxicant estrogens also. There are fungal estrogens, there are metal estrogens, there are all kinds of plant estrogens, but mostly environmental toxins that are estrogenic and act as an estrogen in that receptor that we're so desperately trying to control with drugs. And the drugs work really well in some women and not so well in other women, which just makes it so frustrating and so confusing. What I want to say is there are so many factors, both known and unknown, that we can and cannot control, that any breast cancer patient would be just downright silly to blame themselves for their incidence of cancer or their higher risk for cancer. There are things we really know work, like breastfeeding and having babies. Well, those things are pretty established, but they're not guarantees. We can lean on them as crutches and safeties and feel really good about our cancer risk score until we end up getting cancer anyway. And that's what was true of my podcast guest, Avina, this last week. She had this sense of false security. Because I had babies, because I breastfed them for a nice long time, I am invincible to cancer or breast cancer. And that's just not true. There are so many factors involved in both getting and growing your cancer. You cannot possibly be held responsible for them in an ethical responsibility kind of way. So for the sake of argument, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. When you got cancer, when you got your diagnosis, At that point in history, had you studied the research on cancer risk reduction, and did you know all of the things that we know today that reduce our risk of breast cancer or ovarian cancer, the kinds of cancers that we get that are related to estrogen? Did you know all of that information at the time of your diagnosis? Probably not. Research is changing all the time, so unless you're just diagnosed recently, you can't possibly know everything we know today. More and more research coming out every year these days about how bad alcohol is. I had no idea how bad alcohol was for breast cancer risk, and how good exercise is. I had no idea that it wasn't just nutrition that I needed to pursue. It was also a healthy level of exercise and activity. Well, I was really crappy at that. I was bad at that, I have to say. So even though I was doing my best to study lifestyle effects on cancer risk, I couldn't access all of the research because some of the research was just being done and just starting to come out. And I know now some of the things that I wish I had known then, but I couldn't know then. So am I to blame? Absolutely not, right? Like, you know I'm not to blame. Well, I know that you're also not to blame because you probably didn't have a 10-year advance notice that you were maybe getting breast cancer. You probably didn't have even a few months of advance notice unless you had some symptoms that you were delaying going to the doctor for. You didn't have time to look up what breast cancer risk reduction looks like in this day and age right now at this time in history. And so you can't possibly blame yourself for not knowing all of the factors and getting on top of them. And let's say you did know all the factors. Are you to blame if you're not perfect in responding to all of them equally? I mean, changing your lifestyle that drastically all at once is almost an impossible feat. You'd certainly have to quit your job and focus on those things full time for a while, educating yourself about organic produce and the right kinds of exercise and what is too much and what is too little. Educating yourself about all of the research that's just coming out about alcohol, knowing that it's actually a viable, and does anyone really get training and research? Like, do you know how to tell if a study is solid or if it's a study that's not even worth looking at? Most people don't get trained in those things. And so we just can't blame ourselves for our cancer diagnosis. There's no argument for it. It's really irrational, as natural as it is. It is fully irrational. And like I said at the beginning of this video, the solution for it isn't always thinking about it or writing about it. I mean, those things certainly help. But really, I think the best solution is being in a breast cancer support group full of other women who have worked through their shame and their self-blame and come out the other side of it saying, I am not to blame. Maybe I did something wrong, but I wasn't educated about what that was, and I am not responsible for my cancer. The toxins in this world are responsible for my cancer. And maybe the industries that create those toxins are somewhat responsible, but I am certainly not responsible. I am not to blame, and I shouldn't have shame or guilt around that incidence of cancer in my body. Now, are you responsible now to get on top of what the research is saying and, spend some time every month looking into what lifestyle changes you might want to take and make? Yeah, of course. Now you know that cancer is an issue in your life. And if you're college educated, there are so many resources that are approachable and accessible now online. It can be overwhelming for sure. But that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this channel and starting my podcast. And one of the reasons I have my nutrition channel as well is to help make it less overwhelming for folks, to summarize what we're learning every year and the research coming out. And hopefully that you can rely on me for that to some degree. But yeah, we do have a personal responsibility to stay on top of cancer risk reduction facts. And you can follow lots of people who are really knowledgeable and trustworthy in that area. And maybe I'll put some of my favorite ones down below in the show notes. But I hope that you'll subscribe to my podcast or YouTube channel that is the podcast called A Breast Cancer Diary in both cases. And follow me there for more content like this, because I will only be posting videos here about once a month instead of weekly from now on. So thanks so much for being here and following me and being patient for my videos that come out a lot less often here. It's good to be back here, and I'm sure I'll really enjoy responding to your comments since I have been away for a while. But please do follow me on Instagram at A Breast Cancer Diary with little dots in between the words, and on the podcast players at A Breast Cancer Diary, and here on YouTube at A Breast Cancer Diary. And I'll see you there. Bye-bye.